seen time and time again that Putin cannot be trusted, the Russians cannot be trusted on these peace talks. There have already been several ceasefire agreements since 2014 that Russia has violated. And as long as Putin has this ambition to make Ukraine into a kind of client state of Russia, then the Ukrainians are not going to be able to accept it, because that means for them, but essentially occupation. A lot of people on lists being rounded up, arrested, carried away, and potentially tortured and executed, as has happened in plenty of occupied areas. So this is a matter of life or death for them, and they're not going to simply accept whatever Putin tells Trump.
I'm just really interested to know how the news is going down that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin have had an hour and a half phone conversation and agreed to immediately start negotiations over ending the war in Ukraine.
So the Ukrainians are obviously very concerned that this is kind of welcoming Putin back onto the international stage. This isolation that he's been in throughout the period of the war, with no kind of major international meetings, is coming to an end. And a lot of people here think that that's naive by Trump, because Putin has expressed no real meaningful interest in coming to the peace. Well, he's expressed interest in coming to the peace table, but on terms that are suitable to Russia, which amount to essentially the capitulation of Ukraine. Meanwhile, talking to his domestic audience, he is saying that he does not recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state. He continues to repeat that. So I think Ukrainians, they welcome the idea of peace talks. They're tired. They want some kind of resolution to this conflict, but they don't think it's going to be achieved simply by Trump meeting Putin. Putin is just not going to come to make peace arrangements out of his own goodwill. Trump needs to put pressure on him, and the Ukrainians have yet to see Trump talk about, beyond kind of additional sanctions, what kind of military support Ukraine can rely on in order to enter these negotiations from a position of strength.
Yes, and the tone about this announcement of this phone call was also quite interesting, wasn't it? Because Donald Trump spoke to the aggressor before he spoke to Zelensky. And he then said, I will keep him up for something along the lines of, I'll let him know what we talked about, that we had this talk. And quite a slap in the face also to the Ukrainian president that the defense secretary, the US defense secretary, has also said no to US troops to enforce any peace, no to NATO membership, and unrealistic to think of a return to the pre-2014 borders. So although they're talking about the negotiations, they're already ruling out certain talking points.
Right, absolutely. And if someone who talks about the art of the deal being so important, it's strange to reveal your hand, your bargaining hand, before you enter negotiations. If you're really interested in helping Ukraine, you don't rule out all of the things that Putin might be afraid of. So Ukrainians are worried by that. President Zelensky has said repeatedly that any discussions about the future of Ukraine must include Ukraine. He doesn't like that Putin is talking to Trump directly, and we don't really know what was said in those meetings. We get quite meaningless platitudes from Trump after it. But Ukrainians need to be part of this. They're not going to agree to a complete capitulation that Putin wants. And just talking directly to Putin, it's very naive. We've seen time and time again that Putin cannot be trusted, the Russians cannot be trusted on these peace talks. There have already been several ceasefire agreements since 2014 that Russia has violated. And as long as Putin has this ambition to make Ukraine into a kind of client state of Russia, then the Ukrainians are not going to be able to accept it, because that means for them, but essentially occupation. A lot of people on lists being rounded up, arrested, carried away, and potentially tortured and executed, as has happened in plenty of occupied areas. So this is a matter of life or death for them, and they're not going to simply accept whatever Putin tells Trump.
You told me you've been in the Donbas. Can you tell me exactly, as close as you can, as to where you went exactly and what you found out?
Yeah, we were near Pokrovsk, which is the scene of the heaviest fighting now. The Russians are trying to flank that city. It seems like they've abandoned the previous strategy of taking on a city head on and just kind of obliterating it. I think they've realized at this point they've obliterated so many cities in the Donbas that they need to take one intact in order to have some kind of logistical hub if they want to go further, if they want to establish occupation there. They actually need to have some buildings intact. So they're trying to cut off the supply road into Pokrovsk, which would bring actually the Russians very close to the border of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which is another oblast that Russia could challenge and just try and make a claim to if they get far enough. And the Ukrainian troops that I spoke to are there trying to hold them back, trying to drive the Russians back from positions they'd taken. They also talked about how some of these Western trained brigades had lost ground. Now, these are not Western trained brigades like the 82nd. This is the 150 series of Western trained brigades, and the idea was to take large amounts of soldiers to a Western country and train them en masse, particularly in France. Excuse me. And what had happened there is that these newly mobilized men were not paired with experienced units, experienced officers, and they were given great machinery, great equipment, but as soon as they faced a very serious assault, they would cut and run. And the experienced Ukrainian brigades that I'd spoken to would then have to go and retake those positions. And they were very frustrated that mobilized men were being sent to new brigades instead of sent in to replenish experienced brigades with experienced officers and experienced NCOs.
And did you get a sense of how big this problem is? Because you would think that there would be an adaptation to actually change that if it's not working.
So there has been a kind of outcry against it, and Syrskyi has promised to kind of change it. And Zelensky has also said they will stop sending mobilized men to newly formed brigades. They will stop forming new brigades, in fact, and they will try and replenish the troops in the old brigades. So they are responding to it, but it's taking time to do that. And meanwhile, on the battlefield, there's consequences for the experienced brigades who have to come in and take lost ground, and that causes them casualties, of course.
And the experienced brigades that you spoke to, how long had they been deployed?
So these are guys who've been fighting not only for 3 years, but a lot of them for 10 years already, like during the war in Donbas. We spoke to the Da Vinci Battalion, which is a volunteer unit that has become part of Ukraine's regular army. They're incredibly experienced fighters, and they said, even if you had some officers who had experience in 2022, if you then take them away from the situation and train them, they come back in 2025 and it's already a different battlefield. The things that you need to learn are very different. And they also said that Western training is great, but it needs to be mixed with training from our own officers, our own experienced sergeants, who can tell you what the battlefield is like now and how it's changed, because the Western trainers actually are very often learning from the Ukrainians about their experiences, because the battlefield that they have faced in Iraq or Afghanistan is incredibly different from the battlefield that the Ukrainians face today in fighting the Russians.
And when you were there, I don't know how much time you were able to spend in that area around Pokrovsk. I mean, did you get a sense of who had the initiative, whether it was the Russians or the Ukrainians, and how it was actually going at that particular time?
I mean, the Russians definitely have the initiative. They're pushing forward. They're taking these positions, and then it's up to these brigades to try and take those positions back and hold them. There are some reinforcements coming in. They talked about some reinforcements coming into this area. We won't mention who, but they felt that that was going to help. The more experienced brigades were coming in to try and hold the line. And there were going to be some efforts to try and make sure they keep this supply road into Pokrovsk open, which is really, really critical for the Ukrainians now.
And you're speaking to us, Maxim, from Kyiv, and it's a really politically explosive week for Ukraine, with all the different meetings that are taking place where its future will be discussed, and any peace talks. I heard this morning, speaking on the radio, the former head of MI6, Alex Younger, saying that what's really, really important at the moment in terms of making sure whatever happens with any peace negotiations is that Ukraine's sovereignty is preserved, because that is what President Putin does not want. He wants Ukraine to cease to exist as a country, and that is what is important, not only for Ukraine's security, but for the future European security as well. Do you get a real sense of that where you are? And do you get a sense that this is the moment, and what's been said in the last 24 hours, that European allies will really have to step up and be unified in their approach towards Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, the comments from the US, the approach that Trump is taking, it's either naive or just, they agree with the Russians that Ukraine is not an issue for them. And, Trump is obsessed with China. He doesn't see Europe as being his kind of the big thing that he needs to focus on. So that should be a signal, a very strong signal to Europe and the UK, that it's time to step up, and it's time to, really start spending more money in defense to recognize the threat that Russia poses. And I think it's very difficult for people in Western societies to understand that how different the Russian mentality is. Obviously, war is quite unthinkable to us. But, Putin would not stop in Ukraine. And the reality is, if European powers don't stop Russia and Ukraine, that is going to mean that Russia takes over Ukraine, and all of Ukraine's armed forces, all of the kit that the West has provided, will be in Russian hands on the border with EU countries. And that will provide Russia a very strong platform to then make further incursions into the Baltic countries or on the other side of the Black Sea. it's a very dangerous position to be in. We've seen how Russia will, when it's occupied parts of the Donbas, it immediately mobilizes Ukrainian men and sends them into the fight against the Ukrainian forces. Now, that's something that we could easily expect them to do if they were to take over the whole of Ukraine. You'd see Ukrainian guys drafted, mobilized, forced to fight against their will in the same way as many Russians, maybe against Poland or the Baltics.
Maxim, it's been really good speaking to you. Thank you for your time. When can we see your next dispatch?
In a couple of days, I hope.
Okay, look forward to seeing that. Maxim Tucker, look after yourself. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com. My thanks to our producer today, Louis Sykes, and to you for watching. Bye for now.